Cowboy saw Apache beaten in town, and the silent riders at sunset forced justice to rise. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. The sun was beginning its descent, casting a golden hue over the small town of Dusty Ridge. John Matthews, a weathered cowboy with a rugged demeanor, rode his horse slowly through the outskirts of town. He had been on the trail for days, and the sight of the town meant he was close to home. But as he approached the main street, the sounds of commotion caught his attention. Faint shouts and raised voices echoed through the air, mixing with the dust swirling in the breeze. John's eyes narrowed as he followed the noise toward the center of the town. As he rounded the corner, his gaze fell upon a scene that froze him in place. A group of men, faces twisted in anger, stood in a circle around a single figure. That figure, a Native American man, was on his knees, blood staining his clothes. John couldn't make out the details, but the sight of the beaten man struck him like a punch to the gut. He watched for a moment, the sound of the town's bell tolling in the distance, marking the end of another long day. He could see the fear in the native man's eyes as he looked up, helpless, at the crowd. The man was clearly outnumbered and at their mercy. John's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what had brought the man to this point, but he couldn't stand by and watch this injustice unfold. Without thinking, he spurred his horse forward, riding straight into the middle of the crowd. His presence was commanding, his voice firm as he called out, "That's enough." The crowd paused for a moment, surprised by his sudden interruption. John dismounted and stood tall, his hands at his sides, ready to face whatever might come. He wasn't sure if he was about to face anger or gratitude, but he knew one thing: he couldn't walk away from this. The men around the Apache man exchanged looks, unsure of how to respond to the lone cowboy who had just entered their midst. One of them, a burly figure, stepped forward. "This doesn't concern you, cowboy," he sneered, his voice full of contempt. But John didn't flinch. He stood his ground. "It does now. Let him go," he said, his voice low but carrying an undeniable authority. For a tense moment, no one moved. John could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the heat of the desert sun now beginning to fade into the cooler evening air. He knew he couldn't back down now. The silence stretched on, heavy and thick, until the sound of hooves echoed from the distance. John's gaze flicked toward the horizon, and he saw something that made his heart race. A group of riders, silhouetted against the fading light of the setting sun, were coming toward the town. They were moving in perfect formation, silent and steady. There were no shouts or calls, just the rhythmic pounding of hooves on the dirt. John's eyes narrowed as the riders grew closer. He could see their faces now, their expressions unreadable. They were Native Americans, their faces painted with the symbols of their tribe, the Apache. And they weren't here to negotiate. They were here for something else. As the riders approached, they didn't stop or speak. They simply circled around the group, their presence commanding and unsettling. The tension in the air thickened as the group of men, who had been tormenting the Apache man, looked around, unsure of what to do next. The riders dismounted, their eyes scanning the crowd, but never once showing a hint of fear. John stood tall, his gaze locked on the leader of the Apache riders, a man whose expression was stoic and unyielding. The tension was palpable, and in that moment, everything felt like it was hanging by a thread. The leader of the Apache riders stepped forward, his voice breaking the silence. "This man," he said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet power, "is under our protection. You will answer to us now." The men in the crowd, who had once been so sure of their actions, suddenly seemed small and vulnerable. John watched as the leader's words hit like a hammer, his gaze unblinking. The group of riders stood firm, and one by one, the men who had been tormenting the Apache man began to back away. They had been caught in a moment they hadn't expected, one where justice, not violence, would dictate the outcome. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty street as the riders began to turn and walk away, leaving behind the defeated men and the Apache man they had been so determined to harm. The silence in the town was broken only by the soft sound of hooves fading into the distance. John Matthews stood there for a moment, his mind racing with the events that had just unfolded. The town was still, the crowd dispersing as quickly as it had gathered. And in the distance, the sound of the riders faded away, taking with them the sense of impending justice they had brought to Dusty Ridge. As the last of the riders disappeared into the fading light, John Matthews remained standing in the middle of the dusty street, his horse tethered nearby. The town of Dusty Ridge had returned to its usual quiet, but something had shifted. The air felt different now, charged with an energy that John couldn't shake off. He glanced back at the Apache man, who was slowly rising to his feet, his clothes torn but his spirit unbroken. The cowboy couldn't help but wonder about the events that had led to this moment. What had brought the Apache here? What had made him a target in the first place? John didn't know, but he was sure of one thing: he had made the right choice. The Apache man met his gaze, offering a small, weary nod, the first sign of gratitude John had seen. Without a word, the cowboy turned to his horse and climbed into the saddle. He knew he needed to leave the town for a while, to clear his head. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. As he rode out of Dusty Ridge, John couldn't shake the feeling that the quiet town held more secrets than it let on. He rode for miles, heading into the open plains, the sound of his horse's hooves the only noise in the vast emptiness. It was a welcome silence after the tension he had just witnessed. He didn't know what was coming next, but he could feel the pull of something larger, something beyond the town and its petty squabbles. As the sun dipped below the horizon, John found himself on the edge of a familiar canyon. It was a place he had come to many times over the years, a spot where he could sit and think, away from the troubles of the world. He dismounted and walked to the edge, looking out over the vast expanse below. The canyon stretched for miles, its jagged rocks a reminder of the land's untamed nature. It was here, in the stillness of the canyon, that John could always find peace. He leaned against a large rock and closed his eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over him. The events of the day replayed in his mind, the faces of the Apache riders, the tension in the air, and the silent strength of the man who had stood beside him. What was it about that man? What had made him such a powerful figure in John's eyes? As he thought about it, a sound broke through his reverie, the faint sound of hooves. John's heart skipped a beat. He straightened up, his senses immediately alert. He turned toward the sound, his eyes scanning the horizon. The silhouette of a rider appeared in the distance, moving steadily toward him. As the rider drew closer, John recognized the figure. It was the Apache leader, the man who had spoken so calmly in the midst of chaos. The leader's expression was unreadable as he approached, his horse moving with the same quiet grace that had marked his arrival earlier. John felt a strange pull in his chest, a sense of respect and curiosity that he couldn't explain. The Apache leader slowed his horse to a stop in front of John, his dark eyes studying the cowboy with an intensity that made John uncomfortable. "You did well today," the leader said, his voice low and steady. "But you must understand, this is not over." John raised an eyebrow, confused. "Not over?" The leader nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "The town will remember what happened here. There are those who will not forget, and they will come for you." John frowned. "I didn't ask for this. I only did what was right." "Right," the leader echoed. "But right and wrong are not always so clear. The world is not as simple as it seems, Cowboy." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. John didn't know what to say. The leader turned his horse, preparing to leave, but then paused and looked back. "You are welcome to join us if you wish," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made John hesitate. "There is much to be learned, and much to be done. But you must choose, and time is short. With that, the leader spurred his horse forward, riding off into the fading light. John stood there for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. The offer was tempting, but he knew deep down that his place was not with the Apache. Not yet, anyway. The cowboy turned back toward the canyon, the sun now fully set, and the stars beginning to dot the night sky. There were still questions in his mind, and the answers seemed farther away than ever. But one thing was clear: his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet understand. John Matthews woke the next morning to the familiar sounds of the wild, the distant call of birds, the rustling of the wind through the canyon, and the soft thud of his horse's hooves against the dry earth. It had been a restless night. The words of the Apache leader echoed in his mind. The town will remember what happened here. There are those who will not forget, and they will come for you. John had always lived a solitary life, but this was different. His actions had set something in motion, and he wasn't sure what that something was. The morning sun was already high in the sky as he saddled his horse, ready to leave the canyon and make his way back to Dusty Ridge. The journey was long, but there was a weight on his chest that couldn't be ignored. He had to know what would happen next. Would the Apache come for him as the leader had suggested? Or would his decision to stand up for justice be forgotten in the dust of the desert? As John rode, the quiet landscape stretched before him, the rolling hills and dry plains offering little in the way of answers. It wasn't until he reached the outskirts of Dusty Ridge that he saw the first sign of change. A small group of riders was waiting by the edge of town, their horses standing still in the heat of the day. They wore no insignia, no marks of allegiance, but there was something unmistakable in the way they carried themselves, a quiet strength, an aura of purpose. John slowed his horse, instinctively sensing that these riders were different. He had seen men come and go from the town, but there was something in their presence that made him uneasy. As he drew closer, one of the riders turned toward him, their gaze steady and unwavering. It was the Apache leader. John's heart skipped a beat. The leader didn't speak at first, but simply nodded as if he had been waiting for this moment. John dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. "I thought you might return," the Apache leader said, his voice calm and measured. "You've made your choice, Cowboy. Now, the time has come for you to make another." John felt a sense of déjà vu wash over him. The same feeling he had gotten when the leader had spoken those words to him in the canyon the night before. "Another choice?" John repeated, his brow furrowing. The leader nodded, his dark eyes fixed on John's. "You stand between two worlds now. The town of Dusty Ridge will not forget what happened. They will remember your actions. And they will come for you, in one form or another." John's stomach twisted. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with tension. "You have a choice," the Apache leader replied. "You can stay and face what is coming, or you can join us. We have need of someone like you." John hesitated. He didn't know what to think, but the idea of joining the Apache was tempting. There was a part of him that felt drawn to their strength, to their way of life, to their code of honor. But another part of him knew that his place was in Dusty Ridge, the town he had spent so many years avoiding. "What would it mean to join you?" John asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. The Apache leader paused before answering, his voice low. "It means standing for something greater than yourself. It means fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves. It means embracing a life that is hard, but just." John thought about his time in Dusty Ridge, the injustices he had witnessed, the people who had suffered because no one had stood up for them. The idea of joining the Apache, of being part of something larger than himself, stirred something inside him. But it wasn't an easy decision. "And if I stay?" John asked. The Apache leader's eyes darkened. "If you stay, you will face the consequences of your actions. The town will come for you, and you will be forced to defend yourself. But remember, Cowboy, you are not alone. You have made an ally today." John looked around, his gaze falling on the silent riders, who had not yet spoken. They stood like statues, their presence a silent reminder of the power that lay in the Apache tribe. For a long moment, John didn't know what to say. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him, each choice carrying its own burden. Finally, he spoke. "I need time to think," he said, his voice steady but uncertain. The Apache leader nodded, as if he had expected this response. "Time is something we all have, Cowboy. But not much." With that, the leader turned and signaled for the riders to move on. They trotted away, their horses kicking up dust as they left Dusty Ridge behind. John stood there for a moment, his heart heavy with the weight of the choice before him. The town, the Apache, his past, and his future, it all seemed to come crashing together in a single, defining moment. He knew the time for hesitation was running out. John Matthews stood in the same spot for what felt like hours, the weight of the Apache leader's words pressing down on him. The riders had vanished into the distance, leaving behind only the faint echo of hooves in the air. Dusty Ridge seemed to hold its breath, as if the town itself was waiting for something. John's mind was a swirl of uncertainty. He had always been a man of action, but this felt different. He had seen injustice before, had even stood up to it, but this time, the stakes were higher. Much higher. The sun had moved lower in the sky, casting a deep orange glow over the land, when he finally made up his mind. It wasn't just about what was happening in Dusty Ridge anymore. It was about the larger picture. The Apache had been right. He had chosen a side when he stood up for the Apache man. And now, whether he liked it or not, the consequences were coming. He mounted his horse and turned it toward the town. His decision was made. There was no turning back now. As he approached Dusty Ridge, the familiar sights of the town grew larger in his view. The saloon sign swayed in the breeze, the general store stood at the corner, and the dust-covered street stretched out in front of him. But the town felt different, somehow. The weight of the Apache leader's words still lingered in his mind, and John couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The town had seen the act of defiance, and the people would remember it. He could already hear the whispers. He had helped a man who had been beaten for simply existing. He had gone against the tide, and now, the tide would return to crush him. As he rode into the heart of the town, his eyes scanned the familiar faces. Most of them were focused on their daily routines, but a few turned to look at him, their gazes lingering a bit longer than usual. John couldn't help but feel the tension in the air. It was like the town knew something was coming. He rode past the saloon, where the loud voices of men spilling out onto the porch gave way to hushed conversations. He felt their eyes follow him, a mix of curiosity and judgment. The sheriff, a man named Henry Barrow, stood by the jailhouse, his arms crossed. He gave John a nod, but it wasn't friendly. It was more of a recognition, as if he knew John's presence would stir the pot. The town wasn't a large place, and news traveled fast. By now, everyone knew what had happened the day before. John made his way to the livery stable and tied his horse to the post. The door creaked open, and inside, the stable master, a grizzled old man named Hank, looked up from his work. Hank was one of the few in town who didn't seem to care about the town's petty politics. He always said that the land didn't care about skin color or birthright, it only cared about hard work. But even Hank looked at John now with a hint of curiosity. "You're back," Hank said, his voice low. John nodded, wiping the dust from his face. "Yeah. I'm back. I heard what happened," Hank said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The town's not too happy about it." John leaned against the wooden wall, his arms folded. "I didn't do it for the town's approval." "I know you didn't," Hank replied. "But people don't forget things like that, John. You know that." John nodded, knowing exactly what Hank meant. The town had a way of holding grudges. And if the people had already made up their minds about him, there wasn't much he could do to change it. The question was, what was he going to do next? He had acted on what he believed was right, but that wouldn't stop the town from coming after him. John stood there in silence for a moment, lost in thought. He didn't know if he had made the right choice, but he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. He looked at Hank, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "You think I'll be able to make it out of here without trouble?" he asked, his voice calm. Hank looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "I don't think it'll be that easy, John." John pushed himself off the wall, ready to face whatever came next. The decision had been made. The town could hate him, but they would have to face him now. It was time for him to step up and take the consequences of his actions, no matter what they were. As he stepped out of the stable, the sun was beginning to set behind the hills, casting a long shadow across the town. The quiet had returned, but John knew it wouldn't last. Something was coming, and he wasn't going to run from it. He was going to face it head-on, just like he always had. And if the town was going to judge him, he would make sure they judged him on his terms. John Matthews stood outside the livery stable, the last of the sun's rays slipping behind the horizon, painting the sky with shades of purple and orange. The weight of the day's events still hung heavily on him, but now, as the town settled into its evening routine, the quiet seemed almost oppressive. The whispers had already begun, he could feel the tension in the air. As much as he wanted to be left alone, he knew it was only a matter of time before the town came to face him. He hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly. His actions had stirred something in the people of Dusty Ridge, something he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. He turned away from the stable and started walking toward the center of town. The wooden buildings loomed ahead, their worn exteriors reflecting the years of hard living in this part of the world. He knew everyone in this town, or at least he thought he did. But now, as he walked through the empty streets, he felt like a stranger. He passed the saloon, its doors swinging in the light breeze, and heard the faint murmur of voices from within. It was too early for anyone to be heavily drinking, but the mood was thick with something, resentment, perhaps. The cowboy kept walking, his boots heavy against the ground, his mind focused on what came next. He wasn't afraid, not really. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him. As he approached the town square, he spotted Sheriff Henry Barrow standing outside the jailhouse. The sheriff's gaze met his, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of recognition, a knowing glance. Barrow wasn't one for confrontation, but even he couldn't ignore what had happened. John approached him, his pace steady. "Sheriff," John said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of authority. Barrow hesitated before answering, his eyes narrowing. "Matthews," he said simply, his voice rough from years of hard work and harder decisions. "You've caused quite a stir in this town." "Didn't mean to," John replied, standing tall, his eyes meeting the sheriff's. "But I did what I thought was right." Barrow's gaze softened for a moment, but only for a split second. "Right, huh?" he muttered, more to himself than to John. "The town doesn't see it that way. You've put us all in a tight spot, Cowboy." John nodded, his jaw tightening. He knew that. He had known that from the moment he had stepped in to protect the Apache man. It wasn't just about standing up for what was right, it was about the consequences of those actions. "I didn't expect anyone to thank me," John said, his voice steady. "But I won't back down from it." The sheriff sighed deeply, clearly torn. "It's not just about you, Matthews," he said, his tone heavy with unspoken weight. "You've got the whole town questioning what's right and what's wrong. And that's a dangerous thing, especially around here." John met the sheriff's gaze, unflinching. "I'm not worried about what the town thinks. I'm worried about what comes next." The sheriff hesitated again, his eyes flicking toward the horizon as though the answer was somewhere out there. "You should be," he finally said, his voice low. "Things are about to change, and you're at the center of it. The town won't forget what you did. And there are people who don't take kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble." John took a step back, his mind racing. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice quiet now, almost to himself. "But I'm not going to run from it either." The sheriff nodded slowly, his face hardening. "No, you won't. You've made your choice. Now you'll live with it." With that, Sheriff Barrow turned and walked back into the jailhouse, the doors swinging closed behind him. John stood there for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling in his chest. The quiet town of Dusty Ridge had always been a place of refuge for him, a place to escape from the world's troubles. But now, it felt different. He wasn't sure if the town would ever look at him the same way again. And he wasn't sure if he cared. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his thoughts, and John turned to find Hank, the stable master, approaching him. "You okay?" Hank asked, his voice low and full of concern. "I heard what happened." John nodded, his eyes meeting Hank's. "Yeah. I'm fine. You know, I never thought I'd see the day," Hank said, shaking his head. "A cowboy standing up for an Apache in Dusty Ridge." John gave him a half-smile. "Yeah, either did I." Hank looked at him, his expression serious. "You've made a lot of people angry. You're going to have to watch your back from here on out." John's eyes hardened. "I'll be fine. It's the ones who think they can keep their heads down that should worry." Hank's gaze lingered on John for a moment before he nodded. "I just hope you know what you're doing, Cowboy." John didn't answer at first. He didn't have to. He was sure of one thing: what was coming couldn't be avoided. But he was ready for whatever came next. John Matthews spent the next day in a haze of uncertainty. The weight of his decisions still pressed down on him as he moved through the motions of his daily life. Dusty Ridge was quieter than usual, the usual hum of activity replaced by an air of tension. He could feel the eyes on him as he walked through town, the whispers that had started the day before now growing louder with every passing hour. The Apache riders had come and gone, leaving behind a sense of foreboding. John had done what he thought was right, but now he wasn't so sure. He found himself back at the saloon later that afternoon, the familiar sound of clinking glasses and murmured conversations filling the air. It was a place he often visited to clear his head, to escape the worries that piled up in the silence of his cabin. But today, it felt different. The atmosphere was thick with the kind of unease that made it hard to breathe. He walked through the swinging doors, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and paused just inside. The usual patrons sat at their tables, but there was a strange quietness to their conversations. Every once in a while, a pair of eyes would glance his way, quickly darting away when they realized he was looking. He scanned the room and found an empty seat at the bar. The bartender, a lanky man named Bill, gave him a brief nod but didn't speak. John ordered a drink and leaned back, trying to relax. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice from across the room. "Well, well. If it isn't the cowboy who thinks he's better than the rest of us." John turned to see Sam Johnson, the man who had led the group that had attacked the Apache the day before. He was standing with a few of his friends, all of them smirking as they looked at John. "You know," Sam continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "you really should have kept your nose out of this town's business. But I suppose it's too late for that now, isn't it?" John's eyes narrowed, but he kept his voice steady. "I did what I thought was right, Sam. You don't have to like it." Sam chuckled, the sound echoing through the room. "Like it? Oh, I don't have to like it, Cowboy. But I do have to live with it. And so do you." The tension in the room thickened, and John could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him. He knew this wasn't just about him and Sam. It was about the town. They had all witnessed what had happened, and now, they were waiting to see what would come next. Sam took a step forward, his grin widening. "I'm just saying," he said, his voice low. "You've made a lot of enemies around here. And we don't forget easily." John stood up from his seat, not wanting to let the situation escalate any further. "I don't care who you think I've made enemies with," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not afraid of you or anyone else in this town." He turned and walked toward the door, but as he reached the threshold, Sam's voice called out one more time. "You should be, Cowboy. You should be." John stepped outside, the cool evening air hitting him like a wave. The streets of Dusty Ridge were empty now, the town having quieted down for the night. But as he walked toward his cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Something he wasn't prepared for. He had made his choice, but now, the consequences were catching up with him. He reached his cabin and entered, locking the door behind him. The room was dark and still, and for a moment, he just stood there, listening to the silence. It was in moments like this that he realized how alone he truly was. He had made his decision, but the weight of it felt heavier now. There was no going back. He had chosen a side, and that side had made enemies. And as he sat down in his chair, looking out the window at the stars, he wondered just how far those enemies would go to make him pay. The quiet of the night felt ominous, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. John didn't know what that something was, but he knew one thing for sure: he was no longer just a cowboy in Dusty Ridge. He was something more, something that the town wouldn't forget, no matter how much he wanted them to. John Matthews woke early the next morning, the faint light of dawn creeping in through the cracks of his cabin. The weight of the night before still clung to him, but it was time to face the day. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to spiral out of control. The town had seen his actions, and now, he was going to see just how far that ripple would reach. The sun had barely risen when he stepped out of his cabin, his boots making soft thuds against the dirt as he made his way toward town. He had always prided himself on his ability to keep his head down, to stay out of trouble, but that was before the Apache, before the choice he had made. As he approached the main street of Dusty Ridge, the usual calm of the town was broken by a low murmur. It wasn't just the normal chatter he was used to hearing in the morning. It was something more tense, more expectant. John knew immediately that it was because of him. He could feel the eyes on him as he walked, the whispers behind closed doors. Every step he took seemed to echo through the empty street, and he could feel the weight of every gaze upon him. As he neared the saloon, he spotted Sheriff Henry Barrow standing by the door. The sheriff's face was set in a hard expression, his eyes narrow as he watched John approach. "Morning, Sheriff," John said, trying to keep his tone light. Barrow didn't return the greeting. "You've got some explaining to do, Matthews." John's stomach tightened, but he didn't back away. "I did what was right," he said, his voice steady, but a touch of frustration creeping through. "You can't just do what's right when it goes against the grain of this town." "You've made a mess of things," Barrow replied, his voice cold. "And now people are talking. People are scared." John felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it down. He wasn't about to apologize for his actions. "People are always scared of change," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for the sheriff to hear. Barrow's gaze softened just slightly, but the tension between them didn't ease. "You think this town is going to forget what happened yesterday? You've set something in motion, and you don't get to control the consequences." John took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the sheriff's words sink in. He had known there would be consequences, but now that they were staring him in the face, they felt much more real. "What do you want from me, Sheriff?" John asked, his voice level but tinged with frustration. "I want you to understand what you've done," Barrow said. "This town doesn't take kindly to outsiders making a mess of things, and there are people here who are more than willing to make sure you pay for what you've done." John's jaw tightened. He knew the sheriff wasn't talking about legal consequences. He was talking about the kind of justice that wasn't handed down in a courtroom. "I'll face whatever comes," John said firmly, meeting Barrow's eyes. Barrow nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm not sure you're ready for what's coming, Matthews. But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, the sheriff turned and walked away, leaving John standing in the middle of the street. The weight of the sheriff's words hung in the air, and John couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to escalate. As he continued walking down the street, his mind raced with thoughts of what might happen next. The town would not forget his actions, and the Apache's presence in Dusty Ridge was far from over. He knew he had made enemies, but he also knew that he had made allies, whether he fully understood the cost of those alliances or not. He reached the general store, and as he entered, the bell above the door jingled. The storekeeper, a middle-aged man named Thomas, looked up from behind the counter. "You've got some nerve coming in here," Thomas said, his tone not unkind, but with an edge. "Everyone's talking about you." "I know," John replied, his gaze meeting Thomas's. "But I didn't come here for gossip." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. What can I do for you, then? I need to know where I can find some supplies, John said, his voice low. Something to help me get ready. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Ready for what? Whatever's coming, John replied simply. The storekeeper looked at him for a long moment before nodding again. I can help you with that. But I don't know how much it'll do when the town decides to turn against you. John didn't answer. He wasn't worried about the town's judgment anymore. He was focused on what was coming next, the unknown, the uncertainty, and the consequences of his choices. He had made his stand, and now he had to face whatever the world threw at him. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, John Matthews knew one thing for sure: Dusty Ridge would never be the same again. John Matthews woke the next morning to the sound of birds chirping, but there was no peace in his heart. The tension from the day before had not lifted. If anything, it had only grown stronger. The town was still buzzing with whispers, the streets empty of people but filled with an undercurrent of something far more dangerous. John knew that today would be different. He had made his choice, and now the town would make theirs. He didn't know exactly how it would unfold, but he could feel it coming, like a storm gathering in the distance. He saddled his horse and rode into town, the morning air crisp and cool. The sun had barely risen, but the tension in Dusty Ridge felt thick enough to cut with a knife. As he rode down the main street, he noticed the faces that peered out from behind curtains, the way the townspeople seemed to stay just a little further from him than usual. They had already chosen their side, and it wasn't his. But John didn't let it show. He had a mission now, to make sure that no matter what happened, he would stand by his actions. As he reached the center of town, he saw Sheriff Barrow standing by the jailhouse, his arms crossed and his face set in a stern expression. Barrow had always been a man of few words, but today, his silence spoke volumes. "Morning, Sheriff," John said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of what was to come. Barrow didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied John for a long moment, his eyes hard and unreadable. "You're pushing the wrong buttons, Matthews," Barrow finally said, his voice low. "The town's been uneasy since you made your choice. People don't forget things like that. You've stirred up a hornet's nest." John's gaze didn't waver. "I did what was right," he said, his voice firm. "Whether they like it or not." The sheriff sighed, shaking his head. "It's not about liking it. It's about living with the consequences. You think you're a hero, but you're just one man against the whole town." "I'm not trying to be a hero, Sheriff," John replied. "I'm just trying to do what's right." "Doing what's right doesn't always lead to good things, Matthews," Barrow said, his tone darkening. "You're going to find that out the hard way." John held his ground, refusing to back down. "I'll face whatever comes, Sheriff." Barrow looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "I warned you. Just don't say I didn't." With that, the sheriff turned and walked into the jailhouse, leaving John standing there in the street. The words hung in the air, but they didn't shake him. He had made his stand, and now, he was going to live with it. As he turned and walked toward the saloon, the sounds of the town seemed to fall away. His thoughts were a blur of uncertainty, but one thing was clear: there was no turning back. Inside the saloon, the usual chatter had quieted to a hush. The bartender, Bill, gave him a quick glance but didn't say a word. The patrons, men who had been friendly with him in the past, turned their eyes away as he entered. John could feel the weight of their gazes, but he didn't flinch. He ordered a drink and took a seat at the bar, staring into his glass. He didn't know how long he sat there, lost in his thoughts, but the door opened with a creak, and in walked a familiar face, Sam Johnson. The man who had led the group against the Apache the day before. He strode in with a cocky air, his friends trailing behind him. As they approached the bar, Sam shot John a smug grin. "Didn't expect to see you here, Cowboy," Sam said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. John didn't respond immediately, keeping his eyes on the glass in front of him. Sam leaned against the bar, his eyes glinting with something darker. "You really thought you could just step in and fix things, huh? You're not even from around here. You don't know how this town works. John slowly turned his head, meeting Sam's gaze. I didn't do it for the town's approval, he said quietly. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Sam chuckled, his friends snickering behind him. The right thing? You've made a mess of everything, Cowboy. You've got people talking, and when they talk, bad things happen. John's grip tightened on his glass, but he didn't let his anger show. If you think I'm scared of what's coming, you're wrong. Sam's grin widened. We'll see about that, he said before turning and walking out, his friends following him. John sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle around him. He knew what was coming, but that didn't make it any easier to face. The weight of the town's judgment was heavier than ever, but he wasn't about to back down. He had made his choice, and now, he would face whatever came next. The sun had set, casting long shadows over Dusty Ridge as John stood and left the saloon. The town had spoken, but so had he. And now, there was no turning back. The following day, the town of Dusty Ridge was even quieter than usual. The air was thick with anticipation, a sense of unease settling over the streets. John Matthews could feel it the moment he stepped outside his cabin. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the dirt road, but the town already seemed to be holding its breath. It was as if the entire place was waiting for something to happen, something that none of them could control. As John walked toward the heart of town, his boots crunching softly on the dirt, he noticed the way the townsfolk kept their distance. The usual friendly greetings were gone, replaced by sidelong glances and whispers behind closed doors. The whispers had grown louder since yesterday, and John could feel the weight of them pressing down on him. He had always prided himself on being a man of action, a man who faced his problems head-on. But now, he wasn't sure if the actions he had taken had been the right ones. He had made his stand, but what had it cost him? As he approached the saloon, he noticed a group of men standing outside, talking in low voices. They fell silent as he neared, their eyes following him as he passed. John didn't acknowledge them. He had learned long ago that the best way to deal with the small-minded was to simply keep walking. Inside the saloon, the mood was heavy. The usual rowdy chatter was absent, replaced by an oppressive quiet. The bartender, Bill, gave John a silent nod as he walked up to the bar, but his face was hard, his eyes cautious. John ordered a drink, his mind racing. He had been prepared for this. He knew that the town's reaction would be swift and unforgiving. But now, as he sat there alone, he wondered if it had been worth it. He could feel the tension building in the room, and he knew it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the town, about what Dusty Ridge stood for and what it would become in the wake of his actions. As he took a sip of his drink, the doors swung open, and in walked Sheriff Henry Barrow. The sheriff's face was grim, his eyes scanning the room before landing on John. He didn't say anything at first, just walked up to the bar and ordered a drink himself. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally Barrow spoke. "I warned you, Matthews," he said, his voice low but firm. "You've stirred something up here. And the town won't forget it." John didn't respond immediately. He had expected this. The sheriff had always been the voice of reason in Dusty Ridge, the one who kept the peace. But now, with everything in flux, John wasn't sure if the sheriff's words still carried the same weight. "You're making a lot of enemies," Barrow continued, his gaze steady. "People are scared, and when they're scared, they do things they wouldn't normally do." "I didn't ask for this," John replied, his voice steady but filled with the tension of the moment. "I did what I thought was right." Barrow sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. "I know you did. But that doesn't change what's coming." Just as the words left the sheriff's mouth, the door to the saloon opened again. This time, it was a group of men, their faces hard and determined. They weren't the usual patrons. They were strangers to John, men who didn't belong in Dusty Ridge. John tensed, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of his revolver, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. The men walked up to the bar, and one of them, a tall man with a scar running down his face, locked eyes with John. We need to talk, the man said, his voice rough and gravelly. Barrows stepped forward, his hand raised in a gesture of caution. Easy there. There's no need for trouble. Trouble's already here, the scarred man replied, his gaze never leaving John's. We've been hearing a lot of talk around town. And we don't like what we're hearing. John's pulse quickened, but he didn't let it show. He had been waiting for this moment, knowing that it would come sooner or later. I don't care what you've been hearing, John said, his voice low. You can take your threats and leave. The scarred man laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. You think you can just walk away from this, Cowboy? You've made a mess, and now you're going to clean it up. Barrows stepped between them, his hands raised. This is a small town, and we keep things civil here. The scarred man wasn't intimidated. Not anymore. John stood up from the bar, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You don't know who you're dealing with, he said, his voice calm but filled with steel. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the promise of confrontation. John wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he knew that it was out of his hands. The town had chosen its side, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. He walked toward the door, his eyes never leaving the scarred man's. If you want to settle this, you know where to find me, he said, his voice steady as he walked into the dust-filled streets of Dusty Ridge. The sun had set fully now, the sky darkened with the weight of the coming night. John Matthews knew that whatever happened next, it would change everything.